Steve Hayden was a problem child. At the age of 10, he figured out how to make gunpowder using the Encyclopedia Britannica as his guide. This was perfect training for a copywriter who wrote one of the most incendiary and audacious commercials of all time. When I was a young copywriter and I saw the Apple 1984 spot for the first time, it made me break my pencils and throw my typewriter into the river. I realized I could never be that good. So it's always been my dream to meet the man who created the ad that changed my life, and today I'll have my chance. Steve was a little bit perplexed when I asked him to a woodwork studio in Brooklyn. I thought it was a nice backdrop for ideas coming to life. I wanted to ask Steve how you go from writing TV sitcoms to ads that stop the world in its tracks. What are the right conditions? What's the role of the client? I wanted to know what it was like working for some of the best agencies and toughest clients in the world, and what is the gunpowder recipe for creating a brilliant advertising campaign. Today, it is my pleasure to meet Steve Hayden.
I actually had gotten hired at Chiat Day based on some award-winning work I'd done at very small agencies. And when Apple Computer came along, no one had worked on anything like a computer account. I had, because of all this industrial background. And therefore they said, well, why don't you take a crack at Apple, because nobody else knows anything about this stuff. So I did. Well, as a traditional company, they had advertising managers and people in those roles, but Steve was the first and last word. He was really the contact. He was my client. And he was very self-taught in design, self-taught in marketing, actually. And so a very, very tough judge of creative, and always wanted to reach for the stars, always wanted to raise the bar higher and higher and higher. And the account just exploded. I think the first year I worked on it, it was $8 million. The second year was $12 million. Third year was $100 million. So it just exploded as an advertising account. Chiat Day in that era of the early 80s, had the same culture as a Bronx dry cleaning establishment. So I think there were only 2 or 3 of us doing all of Apple for $100 million on full commission. So Jay pocketed a great deal of the money. We didn't see any of it. You didn't need a huge infrastructure. In fact, we hired our first really professional account person, and Jobs looked at the man and said, "What do you do?" And he said, "Well, I'm your account leader. I make sure everything works properly." And I said, "Yes, but what do you do? Do you write music? Do you write copy? Do you make pictures?" And he said, no, I'm an account person. I make sure that everything functions well." And Jobs just looked at him up and down and said, "Oh, overhead, I get it," and walked away. So yeah, he was quite harsh on account people.
So how did account people add value?
Well, I think to keep the creative people from going absolutely insane, because Apple could be in those days a very brutal account. You know, your beloved work could be torn up with extreme prejudice. Jobs did not mince words. He would say, "This is crap, this is shit. You're trying to make me look like an old lady when all these competitors are coming after me." And you know, people would leave the room in tears. I think what was frustrating was when you couldn't get anything through, even though we felt the work was quite good. But if Jobs, for one reason or another, didn't feel it was fashionable or current enough or cutting edge enough, then it was rejected out of hand. And Jay Chiat was the same way. They both had this, you know, raise the bar, beat the crap out of the creative people, and they will produce better work. And I think we all felt like you know, geese being forced to make foie gras. You know, we had content shoved into us, and then we were supposed to produce something beautiful. So I remember at one point we actually asked Jay to resign the Apple account because it was killing all of us. It was very, very hard on everyone involved.
Did you buy into the whole Steve Jobs persona? Did you?
Yeah, because I think we recognized him as being an absolutely brilliant native intelligence. He was an extraordinary person. And I remember Jobs coming to me and saying, "We need a better name than Macintosh." And I said, "Why? Macintosh is a perfectly fine name for an Apple product. Why would you need to waste time?" He said, "All right, we'll call it the Macintosh." Fine, that was settled. Because the main problem then was, well, how do you sell the damn thing? His briefing for this is, "I think this will change how all computers work in the future. It's not just us, but everything will be influenced by this design." And he said, "When this comes out, I want to stop the world in its tracks." And that was really his brief. Just stop the world in its tracks. I want to get attention. And back in the office in Los Angeles, we had a shuffle pile of ideas, some of which came from the San Francisco office. And we had all these various headlines that were originally for the Apple II. One of them was why we called it an Apple instead of an A6000. And another one was why 1984 won't be like 1984. And Brent looked at that line and said, "I think there could be something in that. Let's think about this line." It's a fantastic line. And when we began, we thought, well, perhaps it should be a silly future, not totally dystopian, but like the Jetsons, like something like that. And we said, well, that's not very cinematic. And it wasn't until we actually met with Ridley Scott, who was in Los Angeles filming Blade Runner, and he said, "No, why don't you take a look at Metropolis? Take a look at the film Metropolis and see if you can draw some of your imagery from that." And that's when we started working on a board that involved skinheads and people marching in line and sort of loudspeakers telling them where to go and what to do, and then this auditorium where a dictator would be haranguing them from a huge screen.
Okay, so that was the storyboard. That was a script that came
was
from
the
you
storyboard,
guys.
yes.
That wasn't Ridley Scott. So,
that was not Ridley Scott. No.
So it was the speech that Big Brother is giving. That was your lines.
That was my line, and the reason was because originally he was going to have nonsense dialogue. It was going to be Unit 65 report to Section 7. Just sort of like that. And when they were casting the dictator in London, Ridley said, well, we can't just have him say, Unit 65 report to so-and-so. Could you write a dictator's speech? And so over a lunch hour in LA, my brother is an old China hand and has spent many years in China, speaks fluent Chinese. And I had lunch with him and said, well, give me some lines from the Peking Daily, from the various communist literature you've read. Give me some good dictator, some good communist lines. Yeah. And so he did, and then I remembered myself, I think it was Mussolini who had the famous line that the democracies will talk themselves to death. So I'm putting all of this together right after lunch. I wrote this couple of pages of dictator speak and faxed it off to our producer, Richard O'Neill, who was in London, and Ridley read the script and said, this is fucking fantastic. I think it should go on the spot. And the casting session then just took off from there with the dictators reading the script that I had written. Now part of the casting session was too, they were looking for dictator glasses, and one of the jokes was that they had these little spectacles, they're kind of looking for Joycean spectacles. And he found out that he looked more odd if he had two sets of spectacles on. Many people wonder why that happened. Well, it happened in casting, and Ridley just said, now that's the look I want. It's just strange enough to work. So we started working up storyboards that would kind of have the portray the negative view of what 1984 might be like, and answer that with a positive revolutionary statement that it will not be as you think it will be. And that, I guess the first radical thought was, there's no room for the computer in this idea. We won't show the computer. We'll just talk about this dystopian world and shatter that image in front of you. And then later on, we'll do demo spots that show what a graphical user interface is, what real-life typefaces look like on screen and in print, what you can actually do with the machine. That was the idea we went in with. Jay, I think, said it's not good enough. The only person who could talk Jay Chiat off a shelf was Lee Clow. And I remember the night before we presented the famous 1984 commercial, Jay rejected that as well as everything else we had in the bag. He thought it all sucked. And only Lee could take him out on the porch and say, Jay, I don't know what else to do. This is the best we have. And we either go in with this or with nothing. I think we had met with Ridley before we met with the client. And Ridley's enthusiasm gave us courage. And I'm trying to think now, I can't, there may have been other spots in the mix. I don't think so. I think we had that and we had demo spots. Now, interestingly enough, we got it approved without too much difficulty going through Steve Jobs and, at the time, John Sculley. And that's we started working on it from that point of view. Now, there was a great deal of resistance, especially from the account people who thought, well, you can't do an expensive commercial without showing the product. You must show the product, of course. Ironically, in the future, when Jay Chiat showed 1984, he always showed the Alone Again spot as well, as that spot that the clients really cared about, because it's such a piece of shit. And it tells you just how misguided we can be in evaluating creative work. One thing you have to keep in mind, though, is back in those days of 1983, Apple was still a startup company. And as such, they had a very conservative board. They felt for the stock market and for their investors, they would look more responsible if they had all these old white-haired guys on their board of directors. Very conservative, very Republican. And so when the 1984 spot was shown to them, they did indeed, the chairman of the board said, can I get a motion to fire the ad agency? Because they absolutely hated the commercial, and then it became very doubtful whether it would ever see the light of day, whether it would ever get on the air.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the Information Purification Directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory laws. Our unification of laws is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Steve Jobs exits Apple. John Sculley takes the helm. You now have a different client. So what was the environment like working under a classically trained marketer rather than a more of a free spirit type of person like Steve Jobs?
Well, in some ways, working with John was somewhat easier. Sculley had a wonderful line because under him, of course, the management of advertising became somewhat more traditional. You had a more classic structure of advertising managers, marketing directors, product groups. And he said often well-intentioned people will try to screw up the work. If that happens, let me know. And he was actually, when we did have something good, he was an excellent defender of the work, but a very, very rational person compared with Steve, who was instinctive, who kind of raised the bar and believed in pushing people to do better than anyone ever expected them to do. Working with Jobs was just an extraordinary experience. Working with John was very positive. It was a very good thing, but much more traditionally sales-oriented. And what does this quarter look like? Are we making our numbers? Are we succeeding in the marketplace?
Tell me, what makes a good client? What's the client's role in producing great advertising, like truly great advertising?
I think it has to do with identifying talent on the agency side. All agencies have great talent. The client can suss them out, can find out, okay, who's really doing the work? Who's really making a difference on my account? I think part of it is instinct, and you come across clients like Aldo Papone at American Express, who would instinctively sense who in the creative department was responsible for what. Lou Gerstner and Abby Konstam at IBM identified, okay, these are the people who are really making a difference and doing things beyond the ordinary for us. And Alan Potash at Pepsi-Cola. And these clients would run interference because the forces of mediocrity are strong. And very practical and rational people would say, well, we can't do that, it doesn't make sense, or it's cost too much money, or whatever it was. And these are the clients who would defend the work and say, no, we're going to do this because we haven't been noticed in 2 years. It's time someone noticed that we were still breathing. And they will defend the creative work up until the board of directors and keep it pure and keep it safe. And if there are destructive influences that have gotten in the way of that, these are the kinds of clients that will run interference for the creative people in the agency and get them out of the way so extraordinary things can happen. It helps to have somebody on the client side to talk to who understands that principle. And it's very simple. All clients are equipped with width-seeking missiles. That is, if they look at a block of copy, the first thing they'll do is take out anything that has the burr of memorability. If there's anything that's unusual, that sort of is interesting, is a little bit different, that's what the typical client will target first and say, well, we've got to get rid of that. I haven't seen that before, therefore it's bad. And you really need a senior client to say, I haven't seen that before, that's good. That's a good thing. It's unusual. People will notice that. And I think it's the difference between, I would say 90% of clients want to preserve their job. They don't want to do anything that'll get themselves fired. It's the rare client who will say, if I do this, my company will be famous. My company will get more value from the advertising budget than they otherwise would because I'm supporting work that will get noticed. And as I've often said, it's better to be noticed once than ignored 1,000 times.
How do you instill a milieu or an environment where great ideas can happen in a team of people?
Well, I think it's part of it, and this gets back to the client relationship, is you have to earn the trust of the clients. And you have to get younger creative people to trust themselves because often they won't show you things if they think they're silly. They think they'll be embarrassed by something. But sometimes the younger team doesn't see what they really have at hand. And it's the creative director's job to work with them and say, this could be very special. Let's look at this differently. Not just to be fashionable or stylish, but to do something that will really punch through. Merrick, anybody can shoot in a quiet place. I mean, any dummy can find a quiet place to run a camera.